Hi everyone. Just to let everybody know that my dog seems to be on the mend, and what it looked like actually after all was said and done and everything was vomited and shit out of her looked to be onion and or garlic poisoning, which, well, what are you gonna do? So yeah, I've been feeding her lots of food and water, which she's been drinking. She hasn't thrown up in a couple of days now. She's pooping again, and on top of that, I've been giving her some very, very good prime rib bones because she needs the meat and the marrow to replenish her red blood cells, which have been damaged by the onion poisoning. So that's cool. It didn't cost me more than $30 or $35 to treat her symptoms with enemas and things like that to keep her hydrated and make sure that she was having enough fluids going into her system and all of that while she was sick. And hopefully she will not be eating out of the garbage again anytime soon. But I'm not holding my breath. Moving on. Today's video. So somebody left a recent comment just today on a comment thread on that video interview that I did with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. And I had sort of not been back to check out what people were saying on that thread or on that in that comment section for a while. And but I got the notification of this recent comment, and I went back and I looked at the thread, and I noticed a question from somebody. The comment thread was about circumcision, and this person was asking me specifically about a month ago. He said, so where does this calmness come from? Or in what way is this calmness you have a part of your strategy? Is it some non-attack measure you apply as an egalitarian? So I thought that was an interesting question, mainly because I have taken some great pains to I've always been more on the calm side than on the angry, ranty side, and that I think has actually increased over the last few years. I just tend to not really get upset about things. So I thought I would answer that with sort of why I am like I am, why I tend to take a calm approach to things. First, I wanted to essentially say that I'm not an egalitarian. I started out a few years ago, 6-7 years ago, in this debate as an egalitarian. And I've since abandoned that. I don't really take on any prescriptive positions or labels. Egalitarian implies that I have a set of goals, right, or a specific worldview in mind that I believe would be beneficial and attainable. Not necessarily in terms of, say, wanting this particular shared parenting bill to go through, or, wanting that paternity bill fraud to go through, or wanting legal paternal surrender for men, or wanting children to be protected from all forms of genital cutting, or anything like that, but more in the sense of having an overall vision for society. Egalitarianism seems to represent an overall vision for society, a specific utopian vision, I guess. And so, yeah, I support some changes and I see them as goals, but an egalitarian society is not one of my goals. So, why? Why would I feel that way? After several years of research and exploration, I'm convinced that the attainment of an egalitarian society is impossible. More important than this, I think, is that I'm convinced that if I have any vision of society, of what I want society to look like, sort of in overall terms, I will be tempted to ignore certain facts that might lie counter to that vision. And I think I've spoken about this before. Now, I've seen this kind of resistance to facts that run counter to the narrative. I've seen it so often in feminist circles, and I've seen it in the MRM, and I've seen it in MGTOW circles, and I've seen it in a lot of places, libertarian circles and socialist circles and all of that, right? But with feminists in particular, I think that they believe they've sufficiently diagnosed the problem, and they have a vision as to what they want the world to look like, and based on their diagnosis and their goal, they have applied a set of cures. Now, they're more than 100 years into the application of these cures, and some of these goals have been met, but they just seem less happy than ever. So I think my calmness, at least in terms of when I'm interviewed by someone like Cenk, and he is recalcitrant, and he just will not get my point. He doesn't want to hear it, and then maybe starts yelling over top of me and things like that. And this is not the first time this has happened, but it is a very sort of, it's like a quintessential example of something like that happening. My calmness in the face of that is partly a result of abandoning vision, right? You know, like when I deprioritized the idea of should and focused more on the idea of is, right? I stopped lamenting why doesn't or why isn't, and I started just asking why does and why is, right? And I think that that's really informed my approach and allowed me to remain calm and remain open to different ideas and remain tolerant of other people's viewpoints, even when they lie in stark contrast to my own. So, I mean, it's kind of zen, right? Like, I still get mad, right? I do, for sure. I mean, like, I do the Rant Zerkers with Alice and Tiemann on Honey Badger Radio's channel, and I can and do get really excitable and angry, especially when I think somebody's being, like, intentionally stupid, right? And that's not to say that there isn't any need for people who have anger or passion when you're doing advocacy work. I mean, that's absolutely 100% necessary, is to have people there raising their voices, yelling, even just getting spittle on their lips and making a big stink. It's absolutely 100% necessary. I don't think that everybody should take my approach, because if everybody did, nothing would probably change. Just because, well, you know, Zen is just all about accepting things and acknowledging that the world isn't perfect and all of that, right? And just trying to adjust and be content with it and find contentment within what is. But when I abandoned prescription, right, the idea that I want things to be this way, and started concentrating much more on description, which is why are things this way, interviews like the one with Cenk, they stop being upsetting. At that point, it kind of just becomes an investigation into why he feels the way he does, what made him so upset, and why did he have the reaction that he did. I don't see him as standing in the way of my prescription, right? Because I don't have one. He's part of my description of why things are the way they are. So he's not thwarting my goals. He's helping me to understand what's going on. And because of that, it's a lot easier for me to view him in a charitable light. And then I ask myself, is there some reason he would flip his shit that on me that doesn't boil down to he's just a bad person? And here's the thing about humans. There was a line in the movie The Talented Mr. Ripley where the essentially the villain, he says, well, whatever you do, however terrible, however hurtful, it all makes sense, doesn't it? In your head. You never meet anybody that thinks they're a bad person. And there's really something to that line. It's a generalization, sure, because there are people who believe they are bad people and who do things that they know are bad. Um, and there are people who believe they're bad people even when they aren't. And that's what makes shame such a useful tool to manipulate others. You are bad, repent, change, and do better. But you never really meet a whole lot of people that think they're a bad person at their core, just kind of inherently, and believe that their own motivations are bad or evil in some way. The reason shame works as a tool of manipulation is because people generally want to think of themselves as good. And if you can convince them that they're bad, their desire to be good will convince them to maybe try and change their ways. It's not nice, but it's effective. At the same time, the degree of harm that someone has done will necessarily impact their willingness to concede that their actions or decisions are not morally right. The greater the harm, the more difficult it might be to admit that you were wrong. Now, Chank wasn't thinking he was a bad person for flipping out on me. I think he absolutely believed it was a reasonable way to respond to what I was saying, and he believes, in my opinion, that he is morally in the right for doing so. That's just human. It's just human nature. Lots of people through history did things that are wrong or bad or shitty, believing they were morally in the right. And I'm not saying Chank flipping out on me is comparable to, say, genocide or anything like that. But most people who do bad things don't think of themselves as bad, and they don't think of their motivations as bad, and they don't do them out of a desire to do bad things. They do them because, most of the time, they do them because they believe that those actions are the right actions to take. Now, one of the most interesting things that I've come across in my travels, in my research, is it was a study of the diaries of medieval knights. Some of them were crusaders. And a lot of them described suffering symptoms that we associate now with PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, blackouts. And it wasn't always because of painful or scary things that had happened to them. It was more often because of things that they had been required to do to other people or to witness happening to other people. Now, it seemed from these diaries that the knights who were most able to cope with their trauma and continue functioning were the ones who managed to convince themselves to believe fully and completely that they were on the side of the moral right, that they were performing God's will, that the things that they were required to do and to witness were necessary to bringing about a greater moral good, a higher moral purpose. And now we might look at a doctor who actively pushes circumcision of boys, who might even engage in behavior that suppresses evidence that circumcision is harmful. It'd be very easy for someone like me who believes circumcision on unconsenting minors is not only harmful but a massive human rights violation to write those people off as sociopaths or as evil or as doing intentional harm, knowing full well that it's a harm. And in some cases it may be. But imagine being a doctor in the US who went through med school in the 80s when circumcision was the norm, with the vast majority of baby boys undergoing the procedure. And it was so much the norm in the US at that time that the only thing that you would be taught in med school about the foreskin was how to remove it and the reasons why removing it is the right thing to do. So you've been going along with that understanding of things for a few decades. The foreskin thingy, that thingy, it's just a flap of skin. It does nothing more than get in the way of proper hygiene. And if leaving it there can cause problems like phimosis, and removing it reduces the risks of urinary tract infections, penile cancer, and STDs. And if it's just a simple snip, right, that he'll sleep right through or won't even remember, well, when you perform a circumcision, you're helping rather than harming a baby. At least in your mind, that's what you're doing. Now, if you're a doctor who is performing circumcisions because you believe that they are helpful and not harmful, that they save boys rather than harm them, think about what it would be like to be confronted with evidence that you weren't helping those babies at all, that you were actually harming them, that the 8,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 circumcisions you've performed during your career, as an obstetrician or pediatrician, during which you believed the permanent benefits vastly outweighed the temporary tears. Well, people are now accusing you of being a monstrous violator of the human rights of some of the most helpless and vulnerable people in society, and of doing permanent damage to adult men before they have any chance or opportunity to tell you no. Now, how would you look yourself in the mirror if that was the message that you were being asked to internalize? If you'd internalized that message, if you'd acknowledged that, yes, this is what I've been doing to these 12,000 babies, it would be really difficult, I think, to look at yourself in the mirror and think of yourself as a good person. So I think you would probably resist the idea that what you did was an unnecessary mutilation of thousands of defenseless babies that resulted in greater harm than good, right? And what if you're a doctor who was circumcised himself as a child? How do you look at your parents? What if you had your son circumcised? How do you look at your son after having made that decision for him? It would be probably a lot easier on you psychologically to reject any and all evidence that what you did or what was done to you was harmful, right? Perhaps in order to continue to believe that you are a good and moral human being who conforms to the Hippocratic Oath, you would double down on the idea that circumcision is beneficial and its harms are negligible or rare. Perhaps in order to not feel betrayed by your parents, you would double down on the idea that they made the right decision for you. Perhaps in order to feel like a good parent, you would double down on the idea that you'd made the right decision for your son. Perhaps in order to feel whole, you double down on the idea that the foreskin is a useless flap of skin that has no benefits and does nothing more than make penises gross, diseased, or unattractive. People want to believe that they themselves and the people that they care about are good, right? And this is where things get really sticky, because this is a conflict that is going on and has been going on in the third world, in certain third world countries, when it comes to females' genital mutilation as well. Mothers do not want to accept that what they have done to their daughters is harmful. They don't want to accept that what their mothers did to them is harmful. And so there needs to be a different approach to convincing people to discontinue the practice than simply saying, you're bad and you should feel bad. Like those nights during the Crusades, you'd be tempted to convince yourself that the horrible things you did when cities were sacked and men, women, and children were raped and slaughtered, that those things that you did, you participated in, those were in the service of some higher humanitarian purpose or greater moral good. Because if you can just do that and really believe it, well, then you can keep the nightmares from consuming you, can't you? In order to convince yourself and really believe it, you have to commit to the idea that what you've been doing is serving a greater moral good, and that necessitates continuing to do it, right? Because if it's in the purpose of a greater moral good, then of course you would continue to do it. It's the right thing to do. If we're to understand and solve complex social problems, we're better served by assuming that people, even those we passionately and vehemently disagree with, are just people. And they're just doing what people do. They have their reasons, and Most of the time, their reasons don't boil down to the fact that they're just bad. Often it's the exact opposite. Often it's an attempt to cling, sometimes by the atoms on the tips of their fingernails, to the idea that they are good. Most medieval knights were not capable of taking a stark, objective, and unflinching look at what they had done without their minds breaking. Not every OBGYN with tens of thousands of foreskins under their belts are capable of taking a stark, objective, unflinching look at what circumcision really is and does without their mind breaking too. When you understand that, you understand the innate humanity of everyone, even the people that you can't stand, even the people who piss you right off, even the Cenk Uygurs of the world. You can understand their innate humanity. It becomes much more difficult to be angry with them or to hate them, and it becomes a lot easier to remain calm. You begin to comprehend the scope of the problem, right? The overarching problem of what it takes to convince people and how far from our reach any proposed utopia might be. And you start to look at society and humanity and just this whole big matrix that we live in. You start to understand that unlike Anita Sarkeesian thinks, and the thing that she says is what informs her entire worldview, there are no systems, at least not as she understands them. Systems aren't designed, not human systems. They just happen. They are, for the most part, only people doing what people do for their own reasons and wanting to protect their self-concept as moral and ethical individuals who belong to something, who belong to a group or to a purpose or to a calling. And these people find other people who think and feel the way they do, or who can be convinced to think and feel the way they do, and then they go from there, and everything just kind of grows organically. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're not, and mostly it's a combination of both. But I think that this maybe helps explain how I can remain so calm when confronted by someone like Cenk. He's just doing what people do. That's all he's doing. That's why I have no problem talking to someone like Steven Crowder, or talking to people who are even more far right-wing than he is. That's why I have no problem talking to people who are religious. That's why I don't have any problem really getting along with a lot of people who don't get along with each other. And that has been sort of a constant source of annoyance for me, is that as I've been doing this, I have actually, I sometimes get those criticisms. How can you talk to that person? How could you agree with anything that this person says? I can't believe you would give this person the time of day. I can't believe that you would say that Matt Forney isn't, the scum of the earth or whatever, right? No, I don't think that anybody is the scum of the earth. I think that 99% of the time they're just people. And that's why I read the Red Pill subreddit, and it's why I engage in conversations sometimes with feminists, and it's why I will go on and be interviewed by people like David Pakman and Cenk Uygur. It's why I'll talk to anybody, is because of that sort of understanding that I'm just trying to figure out why people think the way they do, so that maybe we can, come up with some ways to actually change the way they think, rather than just calling them horrible people. So I I hope that explains a little bit of why I tend to be so calm, even though I can at times get feisty. And I hope that that sort of lays out my position on egalitarianism as well. I think that if you want to call yourself an egalitarian, and that's totally fine, but I just can't do it. It comes with costs. Allying yourselves with a worldview, a utopian vision, and saying here's what I want I want the entire matrix to look like this. That's fine if you're decorating your kid's bedroom, saying I want this and this and this and this and this to look exactly this way. But it's just for me anyway. It's not workable, and it's not something that I can do. So I will stick to descriptive rather than prescriptive, and hopefully I will be able to continue to explain how I see things in the land of is, rather than rail against why I can't live in the land of should. So anyhow, I hope that explains those things, and sorry I'm a little bit late. Dog barf, dog enemas, dog barking. She's on the mend. You can hear her. The doorbell rang. All right, bye.